started. For those of you who haven't had a chance to visit the Inez Greenberg Gallery, we wanted to show you a few images from the exhibit, and I believe we're going to do that. Okay. So at a later date, if you haven't already seen this exhibit, I do hope that you are able to stop into the Inez Greenberg Gallery and check it out. We'll give you some more information about that at the end of the talk. We also encourage you to check out artistrymn.org, where you will find a wonderful video created by our friends at the City of Bloomington, as well as an online exhibition catalog, which has all of the artwork that's in the show on the catalog. And that is on Artistry's website, artistrymn.org. And in case you're wondering, these 3 talented artists submitted individual proposals to our annual curatorial panel review back in 2019. So we combined them to create this 3-person exhibition. Okay, that's our little slideshow. Thanks, Carly. So let's get started. I want to start by asking our exhibiting artists to actually introduce themselves and also share either a favorite material, a tool, or a technique. And we'll start with Teresa.
Yeah, hi. Well, my name is Teresa Audette. I am so happy to be here speaking to all of you today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. My background is in woodworking and furniture making. I have a BFA from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design in furniture design. And yeah, I'm currently living in Madison, Wisconsin in the sculpture program here at UW-Madison, getting my MFA. And I just wanted to share a favorite tool or technique that I enjoy is this. It's called random weave, and I use rattan to make this random weave. And this is a technique that I learned from Anne Coddington-Rast, who is here. And the 3 of us, all 3 artists who are exhibiting in this exhibition, took that class together. What was it, like 2 years ago now? So yeah, that is me.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Martha, how about your introduction?
Yeah, my name is Martha Bird, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I specialize in sculptural basketry. I'm also a board certified holistic nurse, and that really affects my art as well. I got my start in basketry back in '94, and I had been working as a nurse, and I injured my back and I was put on bed rest. And after 2 years of no improvement, I thought I cannot do this anymore. And I just happened to sign up for a basketry class. And I really, really loved it. And so it got me back walking again and moving and connecting with people. And so it really was an important part of my healing journey. And I took classes up until about 2007, and then I stopped for a period of time. And that's a whole nother story about why I stopped. But I did come back to it in 2016. And I decided to apply to be part of the Avivo Artworks Collective. And part of the discussion that happened there, I had a whole variety of work, and I had applied a couple times and hadn't gone in. And so I had talked to the person that runs that program and asked for feedback, and they had suggested that I show that it would be helpful to show a dominant art form. And I said, well, I don't think this collective is for me. I like to do all kinds of things. And she's like, no, you have a dominant art form. And so anyway, we went back and forth, and I realized it was the basketry. And so I applied and was accepted to the collective. And that was really critical for me. I'm still part of that group. And then early on at I had a connection with the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and Wendy DePaulis, the curator there, she, I don't know, saw something in me and had asked to commission some work for an exhibit, and then asked me to actually curate the exhibit. And then my career really took off from there. And I wanted to just take a moment and honor and acknowledge some of my teachers and other artists that have been really important to my journey and my development. And that would be multidisciplinary artist Jess Reyes, and then also fiber artists Ann Coddington and Pat Hickman and Joe Campbell Amsler. So that just feels important. Basketry has a lineage, and it's important to honor that. So I have a love of working with willow. And one of the things I love about it is it's got the inner bark has the base component of salicylic acid, which is the component of aspirin. So being a nurse and having that is really exciting to me. So I'm in the studio, and you can see I've got some willow there. And I do the sculptural basketry, and then I often alternate it with other mediums. And that sort of clears my palette to come back to the sculptural work. So the favorite tool that I'm going to show you is actually, so I can't see, Rachel, I can only see you. Should I go back onto gallery maybe? So this, my willow, well, as you can see behind me, some of it is about 10 feet long, and it gets harvested and then dried. And then I have to soak it 24 hours per foot. So that's about 10 days. So I need a big tank, and this is my favorite tool. It's a 12-foot soaking tank, and I actually have willow soaking in there right now because I'm in the process of doing some work. So that is my favorite tool, and basketry is just, you know, got my secateurs, my awl, you know, it's very few tools. So that is who I am.
Thanks, Martha. Amy.
Hi, I am Amy Usden. I was an avid weaver as a teen in the 70s, and then turned to a career in art direction and took a solid 40 years without even thinking about fiber art. And then it was just a few years ago that I found myself in the middle of a Sheila Hicks retrospective. Hicks was one of the iconic women redefining the fiber arts movement in the 70s. And I remembered that this is what I was supposed to be doing. So in this adult version of me as a fiber artist, I weave abstract mental and physical landscapes onto old nets, like the ones behind me, mostly fishing nets and then fly nets, which were used to protect horses from insects. And it's the fly nets that I find particularly interesting. As objects, they convey a sense of a life lived. It's hard to articulate, but they feel intimate to me, like some comfortable hand-me-down clothing. I think about horses as social creatures. They're capable of loneliness and anxiety and fear, just like the rest of us. And their worn nets elicit a sort of empathy that triggers waves of memory for me. So those are my favorite object. And I just want to say how grateful I was to have this show to work toward during this year of such crazy uncertainty. And grateful to the Minnesota State Arts Board for the 2020 Artist Initiative grant that freed me to work through a time when I most likely would have otherwise been frozen. So that is me.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you all for the introduction. I want to make sure it was unmuted. So Teresa, we'll start back with you. You are currently enrolled in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as you mentioned. Can you talk a little more about what your emphasis is there in graduate school and how it is informing your art making practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I I'm technically in the sculpture program here, but I've also sort of busted my way and informally in the woodworking program. They're all of 20 feet away, so it's basically the same thing. But yeah, it's been really wonderful. So in 2015, I sort of quit my day job and sold all my stuff and, moved into a storage unit and started doing all these artist residencies and traveling around and, spending more time away from home than at home at different art centers and craft centers. And it was really wonderful. And at one point I had a studio visit with a woman named Christine Lee, a woodworker. And she suggested that I look into graduate school and that it could really be like a 3-year-long residency program where you have just the time, the space, and the community to make things with other people and get suggestions and get feedback and learn new things. So it's been really wonderful. It's, of course, starting graduate school during a pandemic is a little bit wild. So, there's where we have access to our studios. They've sort of figured out this every other day situation. So we're not all in there at the same time. But I'm still assisting. I'm basically the shop tech in the sculpture lab, and I assist with classes. So I'm, seeing students and helping people learn how to use a table saw. And it's great. It's, it's exhausting and wonderful at the same time, but it's definitely really informed my practice in ways that I didn't expect. A lot of people last semester just brought up the fact that, really how close furniture is to the idea of performance art, which is a type of art that I had never had any experience with. Beyond going to a theater and seeing plays, I didn't equate me making objects with my hands to this idea of a theatrical or performative art form. So I've been really thinking about that, and I'm taking a performance art class right now, and I'm learning all sorts of things. So yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what happens next. I feel like I'm just letting it happen, letting myself explore.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off. Did you want to add anything or?
No, that's
okay. Moving on to Martha. Martha, your sculptures often contain a spiral form. So could you tell us a little bit about what the significance of the spiral holds for you and for your art making?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Well, first of all, I'll name the technique I'm using. It's called the Perigord technique, and it comes out of France. There's a region there, Perigord, that uses this technique. And there was a woman, Eva Seidenfaden, and she traveled to France and learned the technique, and then was given the blessing from the community to share it with the world. And so she wrote a book. And so learning basketry from a book is not the way to go. It's usually from master to student or, teacher to student. So that's a difficult thing. So back when I talked about in 2016, when I joined the collective, one of the things I thought about was, how do you move from a craft to be an artist? And one of the things is you really need to find your own voice. And so I did a lot of thinking about what did I want to, what is my voice? I don't even know. And I was traveling in Ireland and studying with some master basket makers there. And one guy had a big spiral on his wall. And he had asked me, what do you want to learn? And I pointed to that and I said, that's what I want to learn. And he said, no effing way. And then he said the F. And I said, why? And he said, that is so hard. I will never, ever do another one in my life. And so I didn't get to learn it from him. So I bought Ava's book and I went on residency. I went on a month-long residency where there was nothing else to do. It was in rural Minnesota. So all I had to do was every day try to work on that technique. And so that's kind of the start of it. So what draws me about the spiral? So I've always liked spirals. This technique in particular, it's very chaotic when I'm starting, and I really love that, bringing chaos into form. And Yeah, that's just really, and that feeling every time I'm making one, like, I don't even know if I can do this. I don't know if I can pull it off. I don't know if a spiral is going to happen. And that's how I feel every time. So back to the idea of a spiral, the first recollection I have of that was back, oh gosh, 20 years ago when I was talking to a therapist, and I was having just repeat issues come up. It felt like, this issue was coming up throughout my life. And he compared it to a spiral. And he said, you have this issue and you go around and you work it on and you come to some solutions and then you come back to it. And it feels like the same, but you've actually made progress. And then you keep spiraling outward from there. It may feel the same, but you're actually progressing forward. So that was one association with it. And then another one that I'm really aware of as I'm doing the technique is I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the symptoms that I have with that is this disconnection to self, kind of being cut off from myself. And so as I'm doing that weave where I'm pulling in all these random willow, it really feels like bringing in all the memories and events from my life and really bringing it into one path that then becomes this path that leads forward. So it's about trauma and resilience for me, and it's a real sign of resilience. And then as an RN, one thing that I really love about it is the spiral is a repeat motif that happens in our bodies. So if you think about our heart muscle is a spiral, the umbilical cord, our very DNA, the inner ear is a spiral. It's repeat throughout the body. And then also in nature, so you've got the ram's horns and snail shells and the inside of a sunflower and the artichokes. And then you go out to nature and you have whirlpools and tornadoes. And then you go out to the galaxies and you have the galaxy. And so it's this really, really powerful thing for me of connecting me, my body, with nature, with the natural world, with the universe. And that's just super exciting to me. And I will share, I've been in the studio today working on another spiral. And so I just thought, I'm just midway through. So I just thought I'd show you some of the chaos. And this is a very small one, like the small one that's in the show. It's probably going to be about this big. Some of them are 7 feet. The point that I'm at next is where I'm going to add in about 80 more pieces of willow all along and then continue it out. But yeah, I was surprised when it came to be a spiral. I'm like, what do you know? So that's me.
Thank you. Very cool. Okay. And Amy, you touched on this a little bit in your intro, but your art making, your artwork often incorporates found objects, especially the horsefly net and the fishing nets. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more about what attracts you to them and inspires you to literally weave them into your creation?
The longer I weave on nets, the more I understand why I do. My first horsefly net was a convenience. I had bought it decades ago as a cool artifact, not even knowing what its function was. And over the years, it lived buried in various garages. And then when I realized I wanted to weave again, but I didn't have any easy access to equipment, I remembered its rope structure and thought that that could stand in its warp. So that was my first net. And then thinking my connection to horses, my first memory of horses is from trail rides on a childhood trip out west that seemed so magical that every day for years I would recite the names of the horses in some sort of like weird Pledge of Allegiance thing every day for years. And I looked forward to occasional rides throughout the rest of my life, but other than that, I've had little to do with horses. So I'm surprised at the number of foundational moments and personal associations that their nets evoke. But the impetus for each work is one of those associations. So despite my limited exposure, horses have an outsized place in my brain, and the same holds true for bodies of water, thus the fishing nets. And I thought that was the main draw of the nets, but I've come to recognize that weaving the new into the old has as much to do with the tension of holding on and letting go. When I began my first piece, I'd been caring for my father, who was in severe decline. And I found a parallel to the careful but highly imperfect tending of a worn object that had outlived its use. And the slow process of weaving within and across the fixed borders allowed me space to begin to process the layers of my own history and to consider my own changing use. And through this, I've come to accept that the lens of nostalgia is pretty cloudy. And on that note, the biggest surprise of all was that I really don't enjoy riding horses. So that's my why.
Thank you. So some commonalities that you all seem to share is that your process is very physical and of course tactile. And in addition, your individual artist statements share a theme of personal reflection and healing through your art making. Can you each describe a little bit about why this form of art making resonates with you and whether or not it relates to that meditative aspect that you express in your artist statement? And we'll shake it up a little bit. We'll go with Martha first.
Okay. So after doing basketry for a bunch of years, finally I learned that basketry has been used for healing for centuries. And most recently in the early 1900s with the soldiers with from World War I that had, we could call it now PTSD. At that time it was called shell shock. They were coming back from the war and the nurses were using basketry with them to help them. And then it went along and became actually the symbol of occupational therapy. So it's got a long history of the healing part. And then in terms of the meditative, so it is very meditative, starting from the harvest. When I'm out harvesting, it happens in the winter. And, it's just this clip, 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 clip. And I'm in nature and feeling the weather. And again, kind of that question of, do I have the stamina and the strength to do this? And it's just this very methodical, cut it, throw it into the pile, cut it, throw it into the pile. And then also the wrestling with the materials. So being in the studio today, I have some kirtan. I'm a kirtan music playing really loud, and it's a very rhythmic, spiritual kind of music that it's like, okay, just keep going. Don't think about it. Just keep going. And so it's just breathing and continuing to move my hands and go through the process. And it's a lot of wrestling. And so it also harkens back to that thinking about being a holistic nurse, that body, mind, spirit connection. So the physicalness of the harvest, the physical strength that it takes, the limberness of body and the dexterity of my hands when I'm weaving it. And then the mental part of it is really the wrestling, and it is a natural fiber. And can I figure out how to work through the problems that are going to naturally show up? And then the spiritual part of it for me is, do I have the capacity to create something beautiful? Can I do that? Can I take this pile of sticks and can I create something beautiful? And it takes a lot of trust in myself. And then the whole process just pulls me out of my head. And that is very restorative for me, is to leave my head and get into my body and create something.
Great, thank you. Teresa.
Yeah, I totally agree with Martha. It's like this connection between body and mind that comes from working with your hands. I feel like at some point, I've been, I guess, making art now, well, for a very long time, but professionally for at least a decade, more, I guess, if you count school and all that. But I've sort of flown through multiple different mediums and different techniques and different styles of working. And at some point you kind of look back and you take stock and it's like, wow, this piece that I'm doing made out of walnut wood and carving chisels feels so different from fiber work and basket work and all this thing. And when I look at it across all these disciplines, it's like, it's this repetitive motions. It's this act of just, setting everything up just so, and then I kind of get to tune out and it's just me and my tool and the object. So whether that's, carving a piece of wood or weaving a basket or, you know, anything really, that I think there's a connection between repetitive motions and these things where you don't necessarily, you know, it's a different way of working than when I'm on the table saw or in the shop or talking to someone else, you know, it's just like you zone out and, I definitely think it's like I have a whole series of work from a while back. Some of it is in the show that's called Tools for Emotional Processing. And it's just thinking about, I was just having a lot of anxiety and depression and all these types of things, and just getting into the studio every day and just wrapping something. And I had this whole collection of wrapped objects, and it was just that process, the act of object making was soothing and was a tool for me to process some things I was going through.
We haven't really been sharing a lot of the images. Should I pull that one or an image up that would relate to what you just said?
I think there's a piece called Evidence of Process that you could pull up.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, that piece, Tools for Emotional Processing, was in a show with Avivo Artworks, which Martha spoke about many years ago. So that's funny. Yeah, the one in the top right there with the wood sort of square. Yeah.
Evidence.
Yeah. So this piece, it's the bottom of it there is, well, it's a plank of walnut, and I use my hand plane to surface, to smooth and flatten the surface of that piece of wood. And I also use a little chisel, a little carving gouge to mark the lengths of time. So I was just counting the seconds and making one little cut for each second. And then inside the little bowl is made of paper pulp, and inside of that bowl are the wood shavings from the process of smoothing that piece of wood. So really in thinking the thing that was enjoyable for me was working this piece of wood, but at the end of it, it's still just a piece of wood. You know, I haven't done a whole lot to it. So taking the evidence that the evidence of process, evidence that I touched that object, that I created and shaped that object, I put it in the bowl as some sort of pedestal. It's interesting thinking about this work where I'm using my hand plane just for the purpose of using a hand plane. And I think that's coming into this idea of performance art a lot. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Okay, and Amy.
Well, yes to the idea of zoning out. Also, the slow process for me of weaving in and out with the needle allows room for epic stream of consciousness. So on one hand, I'm rambling, but then it allows room to think about nothing at all, which for me is like the ultimate form of mindfulness. And those long periods of nothingness are necessary to balance the inevitable anxiety that comes when one finished section precludes the next because of the structure. You know, the fixed nets only allow certain things, and if you do one thing, then maybe you can't do the thing next that you thought you could. I once heard an artist describe his process as having a conversation with his materials, and I really didn't get what he was talking about, but I definitely do now. It's a constant negotiation, and the work continually morphs aesthetically and conceptually. And if you want to show the weight of it, I can give you an example of my rambling beginning to end. It started as, the weight of it ultimately became a piece, yep, that one. Does it not want to be big? Well, that's okay. Anyway, that one ultimately became a piece about the weight of motherhood, but it started again with a simple thought about a horse. Before you mount a horse, the handler always asks your weight. And I remember a distinct look on my mom's face as she responded. And despite my young age, I sensed that was, my introduction to weight dysmorphia. Then I'd flash to a note that her mother had written her saying, perhaps she should take up smoking so she could lose a few pounds. And then my mind would jump to the days when the school nurse would hold mass weigh-ins and shout out our weight in front of the entire class. And then a few memories later, I think about my young daughter who was just beginning puberty, and she always wore like super baggy clothes. And then one day when she didn't, I casually said, "Oh, you have a waist." And though she didn't tell me until years later, she was secretly mad at me for months because she thought that I had implied she was fat. And so as the weight of it took on its vaguely feminine form, it became a piece about revolving histories and the weight of the things we say and do that burden the next generations.
Right.
So that is my story.
Thank you. So historically, artists, you absorb, you reflect on, you scrutinize, you mirror back, and otherwise comment on the challenges that are happening during the day, the day, whether it's you personally or communally. Sometimes that process happens instantaneously, and other times it's much slower. It takes a longer time to process. It's fair to say that this has been a really challenging and difficult year. And as artists, we would love to hear how you have processed this past year. And, could you share with us how it has affected you, your artwork, and anything that you have learned about yourself and this process of art making over this past year? And maybe we'll start with Teresa.
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to, when I was thinking about this question, I was trying to take stock and sort of realizing, wow, it's actually been like a year, hasn't it? We're going up on a year of doing this. So for most of the year, was in Minneapolis. I moved here to Wisconsin in September, something like that, August or September. But the most of this year was just in my house in Minneapolis. My partner and I spending a lot of time with each other. And thankfully I had a little space in the basement there. So I had, no longer unfortunately, but I had a studio in Northeast Minneapolis for almost 10 years. And so I still had access to that space, but only really like once a week or twice a week, maybe. So for the most part, I was downstairs in my basement. And I think that, I know that led me to just working more with fiber materials and things that I could do in my basement. So I got a few books. I don't know where they are now, but I got a few books at the thrift store on basket making and watched YouTube videos and just tried to learn new things and, listen to like 40 audiobooks throughout the summer. But I think what I really learned was that, it just drove home that isn't enough for me. Just making stuff isn't all of it, it's I have to make stuff and show it to people. I also have to teach people how to make stuff. I learned how important that was by not being able to teach anybody things this summer. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Martha.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really learned once again is that I really have to trust myself and my creative energy. And if there's a lull, that I have to realize that my creative energy is going to come back. It always does. It's hard to trust myself with that. I get nervous around it. So my work is inherently around hope and resilience. And so that's just really important. These times really call for that. I did notice that my energy shifted, talking about starting back at the pandemic stay-at-home order, the end of March. My creative energy really went down for a bit. And then I noticed that I wanted to start making functional baskets again, which I hadn't done for years. I didn't want to, the sculptural, but felt a little harder to me, kind of pulling something out of the air, creating something that I'm not sure where it's going to go. So I built this big, huge structure to support my peonies in the summer. And that felt really great to create that. And then just really serendipitously out on a walk, I met a neighbor And we got talking, and she had interest in learning basketry. And I've always said no. For 25 years, I've said no. I just, I like to create myself. It actually has more to do with confidence. I didn't have the confidence that I knew anything to teach, but she had asked, and I thought about it. And I said yes this last summer. And so I actually mentored someone. We wove outside, and we made a number of baskets, and that was really, really wonderful. And then come the fall, I could feel some of my creative energy coming back, and I made that small spiral. I don't know if you, Rachel, have access to those images. I can just talk about it if you
Try
don't.
and share it again, but
It's the one called This Way Out
she might
that I
be sure to
made in September, which was the small one.
use our work archive and go back.
And that one was just, again, it was that idea of, yep, that one, just small. And it was that idea of like, how do we get out of this? How do I get out? How do I keep moving forward? And then the next piece that I'm going to talk about is Nebula. And that's another example how what's happening in the environment really affects me. So that one is about 7 feet wide. That was the very first one I did when I was learning the Paragord technique. And I kept track of how many pieces I was using in case I wanted to make it again. I'd know how many pieces. And so as I was weaving things in, it took 206 pieces of reed to make that, and didn't think anything of that. And I was talking to someone like months later, and I was like, yeah, it takes 206. And then I realized that's how many bones are in the human body. And I just was like, how does that happen? So when you talk about absorbing things. And then the next one I'm going to talk about is Taken. And this was one that had to do with suicide, and somebody that I knew died by suicide. And this Paragord technique, the center is what holds it together. And so what I did was I took a torch and took out the center and burned some of the pieces along the side. And so it's a very fragile piece. And that was how that came out in my artwork. And then that's all the images that you need to show. But I did want to just talk for a few minutes about other couple of pieces that I made that I was really proud of. When we had the stay-at-home order, and then a couple weeks later, I thought, this is going to take a lot of courage to get through this time period. I'm going to have to just rely on myself completely with everything shutting down. And so I had a glass bead that said courage on it. And then the next thing was when George Floyd was murdered, and we had the uprisings, and I lived just a couple blocks from there. And I woke up the time of the fires, and there was ash in my yard. And so I gathered that, and then I took a bag and walked over to the site where all the fires were. I wanted to help clean up, kind of be in reality with what's happening. And I saw that my library, where I have shown art and I taught my first class, and the glass windows were broken. And I just felt this need of like, I need some of that glass, and it had been cleaned up. And so I scoured the bushes and gathered some of that glass. And I thought, okay, courage bead glass from this, that's going to be a mosaic. And so I created that piece, finished just in December. And then I took the ash from the fires and did rubbings on paper, and then used an eraser and ended up bringing forth some images of hand gestures that to me represented the time period. So yeah, I would definitely say that what's happening in the world comes through me into my art.
Thank you. Amy.
Yeah. The isolation of the past year has made me feel very disconnected. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but it marked a move from more autobiographical meditation to work that speaks more broadly to loss and longing. And I think there's two pieces in the show in particular that reflect that. The first is the Shroud, Thoughts and Prayers. If you can bring that one up. With a fly net, it's the movement of the peripheral fringe that offers the protection from insects. And when that fringe is bound back into the body of the net, it becomes incapable of providing comfort, much like the empty thoughts and prayers from those in power who refuse to enact meaningful change. And this year we definitely needed change. Also with this piece, in acknowledging the duality of nets as protection versus entrapment, I think that's a familiar tension to all of those who are isolating in our homes this year. The piece considers the meaning of objects and our own conception of security. And the second piece would be to grandmother's house. That's the first in a series of leather fly nets that begins to dismantle the oversell of that winter carol over the river and through the wood. This year, the holidays were so rough, for so many people, and winter has been very cold and dark, and grandma, in fact, was probably alone. So this is the first of a series of pieces I'm doing on that theme. Those are just a few of the ways that life has seeped into my work this past year. That's it.
Thank you so much. We've got some great questions from our audience, so I'm going to jump to those if that's okay, and I'll go to the top. And you may have touched on some of these, but maybe just briefly, since we do have quite a few questions, maybe talk a little bit again about answering some of these questions. So the first one is to all three of you, what have you found are the health benefits of working with your hands? So let's start at the top again with Teresa.
Sure. Well, I have spent years trying to collect data and habits and track myself to figure out why exactly. And I have no idea why, but all I know is like when I'm really stressed out and freaking out, if I just sit down and start making something, I feel better. I can't explain it more than that, really.
Yep, great. Martha.
Yeah, I would say it's getting out of my head is really restorative. Getting out of my head into my body is really restorative for me. And then on top of it, creating something that I find beautiful, or in contrast, sometimes it's just something that I've expressed and I can look at it and I'm like, yeah, that's how I feel, or yeah, that's what I'm struggling with. So to be able to actually take it outside of myself and see it is helpful.
Great. And Amy.
Well, literally, when I think of that question, it's actually hard on the hands, what I do. I've given myself trigger finger and all sorts of strange things, hand issues, but I completely agree with the zoning out and I don't know what I would have done this year had I not had this to calm me down.
Yeah, understood. So we had a request to show some images, which I think we've done, but we'll also, for those that entered late, we did have a slideshow, and we'll play that again at the end if you want to stick around. I'm happy to run that slideshow again that has images of the gallery and the work together. So another question to all three of you, have you found interest and pleasure in teaching others to work with their hands to benefit their own health? So Teresa.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been teaching, I think the first class I taught was like 2012. So I've been teaching for a little while, but most of the teaching I've done is at the Women's Woodshop, which is now called Fireweed Community Woodshop in Minneapolis. We had a physical location on 38th and Cedar, something like that. But anyways, due to COVID, it's sort of all online now, but there's still a lot of folks teaching classes online. I've found I learned things about myself and my own practice through teaching others. And maybe I'll just use this as a perfect moment to say I'm teaching a class at Aramont School of Crafts this summer. It's called Sculptural Woodworking and Experimental Techniques. It's going to be super fun. They've got lots of COVID safe things. So, but yes, I absolutely love it.
That's awesome. Martha.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I was really scared to teach, and I've really avoided that for a long time. And then this summer and a little bit before that, I decided to really pay attention to this idea of passing on this skill of creating something with your hands to help with health, instead of how perfect can I help teach this. And I was inspired by, I can remember his first name. It was at the National Basketry Organization conference, and his name was Clay. There was a panel, and they were asking questions about teaching. And what his response was, is I'll tell people that I will share what I know. I won't teach them, but I'll share what I know. And so I think of it in that way. I'm going to just share what I know. And when I do that, I feel very relaxed and very comfortable. And it's a very back and forth. And I really, I've enjoyed it.
That's great. Thank you. Amy, have you done any teaching or plan to?
I am far too introverted to teach. I basically, with my work, I thread a needle and I go up and down and up and down. And I have no idea what I would teach.
Well, I don't know about that, but I understand the introvertness about that. I agree, but I like Martha's comment of showing people what you know, and that's a good way to approach it. Our next question is directly to Teresa. I love the direction of your work. What role does functionality play in your work? Are you more interested in exploring craft mediums through object making, or do you feel more representative of conceptual interpretation of craft mediums? I hope I got that.
Wow, what a question. That's great. That's something I think about a lot, I guess, especially thinking of, starting from a role as a furniture maker, we're really thinking about function. And then sort of morphing into realizing, well, the function of this art is that it helps me feel better about whatever it is, myself. And I guess it's such a big debate of craft versus art and concept and, et cetera. But I do really like, well, I was about to say, I really like the term object maker. I think I can relate to that, saying, okay, function, utilitarian function or maybe performative function, but I'll always be an object maker. But I'm now in this performance art class, and we just did a performance project where, there's no object. It's just you change one action to your day, and think about how life and art can be all in the same thing. But yeah, I've actually done, just last semester, I started doing some work with concrete and cement, and just as an exploring a medium, I'm really interested in something heavy, something weighty. And I was thinking that it's so the opposite of like eco-friendly, right? Most of the materials I use are natural fibers or wood. There's this connection to the earth. And so thinking about concrete, I guess it's the first time I'm maybe it's not a craft medium. So I'm sort of not sure where it fits into my practice. Maybe what I really want to be doing is stone carving, but that seems intimidating. I feel like I'm not sure if I've answered that question properly, but all of the above.
Sounds like you're exploring lots of things, and we'd love to see where you take the cement and concrete. So
yeah,
that's great. So another question is that I'd love to hear about how each artist copes with the history of these techniques in regard to their practices. So Teresa, why don't you continue on, and we'll start with you.
So what's the question again? The history of the history of the technique.
How each artist copes with the history of these techniques in regard to their practices.
Yeah. It's interesting history. I think Martha was talking about this a bit of so many basketry mediums, and maybe a lot of, well, again, I hate the distinction between craft and art or whatever, but many of these sort of more technical craft skill-based mediums, it's not generally something you go to university to learn about, spoon carving or basket making or whatever these things are. You usually do it in an apprenticeship system, or you learn in some sort of cooperative space. So this history feels like I think about, there's a, I almost brought it, but I didn't want to take it on the bus, but I have this hand plane that was given to me by my mentor, a woman named Cecilia Schiller. And it was given to her by her mentor, this man, Charlie, right? So it's just a tool like any other tool I use. It's, but it has these initials, CW. And every time I use it, I just think about the fact that there's 100 years of knowledge running through, you know, not only this tool, but my mentor, the knowledge she gave me, the knowledge he gave him. So it's, I feel really, really lucky and special to have all of this history and all these craft centers I've worked at, you know, working at Penland or Anderson Ranch. It's, you know, there's decades of history embedded in there, and you sort of get to feel a part of it. Yeah, it's really interesting. And also just the field of woodworking has a, you know, interesting history in regards to women being allowed, in or not. And that has, I think, really been changing a lot in the past 30-ish or however many years. So it's really, really an interesting thing to see specifically the field of woodworking and how it's sort of looking at its own history.
Thank you. Amy, let's go with you on the history of these techniques and how it affects your practice.
Well, weaving obviously has a long, long history, but the kind of work I do, I think does have its roots back in the 60s and 70s when, you know, all those great people like Sheila Hicks and Lenore Tawney and, you know, endless others were really developing the field. And so since I worked with these techniques, you know, as a teenager, and then I stopped, when I started again, I just kind of fell back into them as those great artists as my influences. So I feel very connected to the beginning of that type of, that era of the fiber movement.
Great, thank you. Martha.
Well, that's a really full question for me. One is that, you know, basketry's been around since the beginning of time. And so there's nothing new that's being made out of it. And that idea of honoring our teachers is one thought. Another thought, I mentioned that I stopped weaving in 2007. And that has to do with you know, in the early 1900s, the soldiers were using it in the hospital. And then as it moved into the 50s, there was a stigma that came along with basketry and some pretty widespread jokes that people would say using the term basket. And I'm not even going to repeat them because I don't care for them. But whenever I would tell somebody I was a basket maker, I would hear those jokes, and they have to do with mental health stigma. And because I have my own mental health issues, that just felt way too close to home. And I actually quit basketry, and that was a big part of it. I just didn't want to deal with that. And so when I came back to it with the support of the collective that I'm in, which is Avivo Artworks, which is our mission is to challenge mental health stigma. I started to research, and I decided I'm going to start talking about that and naming it directly. And I actually have a lecture that I created. It's a very deeply researched lecture about what happened in basketry from the 3rd century, you know, the beginning of time to the 3rd century, all the way to the soldiers, and then to the 50s and on. And it's I couldn't answer any of it now because you have to go step by step to really get what happened. But being able to talk about that real directly, it was really, really helpful for me. And so that's how I've incorporated that. And I still hear those same comments, and now I can actually address them rather than just feel bad. So
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to wrap it up with one more question from our audience, and I think it's a good one to sort of close it out. Can you talk about a typical studio day, a best studio day? Like, what would your favorite day in the studio look like? And yeah, we'll do this one a little quickly, but go ahead, Martha. I'm just going to let you keep rolling there.
I touched on it a little bit. If I could just turn this computer around, you'd say like a mess everywhere in my studio. So it involves many hours, usually 6 to 8, because the willow starts to dry, loud blasting music. That's very meditative, several different meals so I can stop and take a break. Yeah, just be in the willow.
Great. Teresa.
Well, I'm gonna just like dream and think back to a pre-COVID world because that's my ideal studio. But you know, you go into a space and there are other people there who are like happy to see you, and you smile and say hi, and then you go in, and I make whatever it is I'm making. I soak some reed, and everything works, and nothing breaks, and no tools break, and I don't hurt my hands, and I remember to eat lunch. Yeah, that's my ideal day. Listen to a good podcast. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Amy.
I sometimes work 12, 14-hour days. When I was a kid, I used to listen to my dad's musical records. When I was weaving, like Pajama Game and My Fair Lady, I had one of those record players where the needle would just keep dropping and repeating. And so I would just listen to those on end. And sometimes I actually do that now. I listen to silly musicals just on repeat all day, and I am happy.
Wonderful. Well, we all hope you many, many wonderful hours in your studios creating more of the amazing art that you have shared with us, and that's in Woven at the center. I'm going to thank our artists so much for sharing your time with us and sharing your abilities and your art. As you close out, Carly, maybe I will have you, we'll say goodbye to our artist, but I want her to share the slideshow again as we wrap it up so that people can see the art together as it looks in the gallery. And while she's doing that, I will finish with my closing remarks, which is of course thanking our audience as well. We really appreciate the number of people who joined us today, 50 some people, which was fantastic. So thank you all so much, and you're participating with the questions, really great questions. I wish we could have talked for hours, but just to respect everyone's time. And want to make sure that you know that this show is open through February 19th in the Inez Greenberg Gallery, which is at the Bloomington Center for the Arts, located at 1800 West Oshakopee Road in Bloomington, Minnesota. It looks like Carly might be having a challenge sharing that slideshow, but so you might have to go out there and see it. The gallery is open. The building is open Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Wednesday and Fridays from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And again, you can get more information about the gallery, the exhibit, the exhibition catalog, and a great video by the City of Bloomington, all on our website at artistrymn.org. We really hope that we see you all in the gallery soon. And good night. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for sharing.
Gorgeous work. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see
Great
you.
job.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
Fabulous. Thank you for sharing.
Great. Thank you. everybody. Really appreciate it. Take care. Have a good night.